Hi, everybody. Welcome to Kindred Skulls. My name's Matt Freese. I'm here with my co-host, Nick Olson. It's our first episode after the NFL draft, so we've got a bunch of new Vikings players to talk about. How you doing, Nick?
I'm doing great. It was a fun draft. I mean, all those trades, all those players, they got a few guys that I really loved. So they kept it interesting the whole weekend. So it was a lot of fun. And now we finally get to dive in and see what all these guys are all about. So it's been fun. I've been like deep in the Lewisine tape. I watched like all his snaps the past few days. So yeah, it's fun watching these guys and kind of understanding the fit and the vision for these guys and what they're going to do for the team. So I thought it was a great draft, and I'm really excited to get into it.
Yeah, absolutely. And first, I guess we want to shout out, the Climbing the Pocket guys did a live stream all weekend. Nick and I hopped on both Thursday night, day one, and for a couple hours each on day three, closing out. So if any of you guys listening, hung on with that, thanks for hanging out with us. It was a great time. We had a lot of fun going ahead and talking ball and kind of giving the live reactions there. And then also, if you want to hear our live reactions, you can go over to the Climbing the Pocket YouTube channel, search that up. Obviously, it's like hours and hours of streaming content that happened over the weekend. But check it out. You should have also gotten to this feed, our live reactions from day one, both the trade and the Lewisine picks. So check that out if you haven't. But if we flip into it, I'll go here and I'll just read off of the picks that we made, right? And this is after all of the trades. We made a ton of trades on draft day 6 during the draft, which was the most of any team. But overall, our first round pick, number 32 overall, was Lewisine. He's a safety out of Georgia. And then second round, number 42 overall, we took Andrew Booth, a corner from Clemson. A name you guys probably recognize if you listened to us before the draft. Number 59 overall, still a second round pick, Ed Ingram, guard out of LSU. Third round, number 66 overall is Brian Asamoah, linebacker from Oklahoma. Fourth round, 118 overall, was a Caleb Evans, corner from Missouri. Fifth round, 156 overall, was Asezi Otomow, a defensive lineman, defensive end from Minnesota. Still the fifth round, 169 overall, Tai Chandler, running back from North Carolina. Sixth round, 184 overall, Vaderian Low, offensive lineman, offensive tackle, really, from Illinois. Sixth round, 191 overall is Jalen Naylor, wide receiver from Michigan State. And finally, in the seventh round, 227 overall, Nick Muse, tight end from South Carolina. So that's the overall picks that we made in the draft. I think there are a couple overarching themes that you can take away from this here. The first one, I think, is pretty obvious, where we identified and clearly showed the need in the secondary, right? Nick, this is something you and I talked prior to the draft about, how secondary was our biggest need, both corner and safety a little bit. I mean, obviously we do have Cameron Bynum, who people are pretty excited about, but to me, he started 2 games last year. He was a 4th round pick. He's not somebody who, while he was penciled in as a starter, he's not somebody that I necessarily would rely on. And I view Cam Bynum pretty highly. Like, I think he has the potential to become a starting NFL player, but it's not something I felt comfortable with going into the season with just him. Now, spending a first round pick on Lewisine, I feel a lot better about our secondary and our cornerback room, adding Andrew Booth, who we both had as our 3rd ranked corner at least. You might have even had him 2nd over Stingley. Adding Booth to that mix, I think really bolsters our cornerback room. The fact that we re-signed Patrick Peterson, now we have a room that I feel like we can go into the NFL season and, they can hold up 2 NFL wide receivers in that room, assuming health for Andrew Booth. Obviously, that's part of the reason he was available at 42. So overarching thoughts on the draft class from you, Nick?
Yeah, it's really interesting that they invested so much draft capital into the secondary. I mean, clearly it was a need, but you could also say, they had a need on the interior offensive line. They had a need along the edge defenders. They didn't really take any edge defenders, especially if you consider Asezi Otomow as like a 5 technique or a 4-eye or like a. It's not entirely clear they see him as a pass rusher necessarily. That's probably where he winds up. But other than that, 5th round investment, they didn't really invest anything into the defensive line. So yeah, they went safety in the first round and they went cornerback at the beginning of the second round. So they kind of traded down and wound up netting them both Cine and Booth. So it's really interesting. And then they were willing to double up on the cornerback. They took 2 boundary corners and they traded up for both of them. So really interesting. Clearly, I think they had their name. They really were high on Andrew Booth. They were willing to trade up for him. It's possible that at 34 they were like, we're happy with him, Kyler Gordon, Roger McCreary, or any of these guys, and we'll just take the last one that falls since we have him in a similar tier. But it also kind of feels like they knew Andrew Booth would fall because of the medicals, and they were willing to move down and then trade back up to snipe him, which is what they did. So played that board really well. And then Caleb Evans, obviously, they also traded up to get him, traded future capital to go up to get him. They paid a lot. They paid a current 5th and a future 4th to move up to the 4th round for him. So that was a lot of trades on draft night. That was probably in the grand schemes, not as big as like trading a first rounder, but in terms of just like how much we lost, that was the biggest loss of the night. So
yes.
It was interesting. It was interesting hearing Kwesi talk after the draft about like, I traded commodities at a hedge fund on Wall Street. So this is a lot like that. I'm trying to find pockets of value throughout the draft, and we're trying to make sure we're targeting our picks at the right spots, because there are some places where it doesn't matter if you have the pick right now or pick 10 picks from now, because you'll be picking the same player or a similar tier of player. There are other places where there's a huge steep drop off after this last guy goes. So clearly they had that in mind when they were targeting some of these guys. Clearly they had seen ranked, I think, in the teens they mentioned on their board. Interestingly, the Cowboys also had Lewis Cine ranked. That the Cowboys board was leaked,
yes.
and Lewis Cine showed up as number 13 on the Cowboys list, who they were willing to pass over for a tackle, and Tyler Smith. Is that his name?
Yes, correct.
So, it's interesting. I will say, some overarching thoughts, they really valued explosiveness. They really valued guys who really come downhill. That's obvious, I think, if you watch the tape of some of these guys, like Lewis Cine, man, does he come screaming downhill fast. Same thing with Andrew Booth. Andrew Booth didn't test, but like, man, like that's like the biggest thing about him is like, boy, does he just like, when he has a target, he will just go good, slingshot out. That's true of Asamoah as well. Just guys are flying around the screen. And it shows up, I think it's true of Naylor as well, like these explosive guys, like not necessarily fast, but explosive, and it shows up in their 10-yard split. When you look at like the metrics that the Vikings cared about, a lot of these guys had like crazy fast 10-yard splits. So Lewis Cine had the fastest 10-yard split by a safety ever. I'm not sure if people are aware of that, but it was a 1.45 second 10-yard dash. That's the fastest of anyone in the entire draft this year. And it's tied for the fastest 10-yard split of any safety in like Mock Draftable's entire database going back to 1999. Tai Chandler also had the fastest 10-yard split of any running back this year. And like everybody had, Booth didn't test, but he was really explosive. Asamoah had like a really great 10-yard split. Caleb Evans had a really great 10-yard split. The trenches guys didn't as much. They had like good. Otomow, it depends on like if you measure him as like a edge defender or as a defensive tackle. Obviously, you shouldn't lump him in with nose guards, but it's probably not also fair to lump him in with guys who weigh 30 pounds less than him. Same way if you're not going to compare him to guys who weigh 50 pounds more than him. So, but especially for like the back 7 defenders and the skill players, that explosiveness really matters. They valued length. Especially in the trenches. Otomow had the second longest arms of any edge defender. The only guy with longer arms went number 1 overall, and Trayvon Walker. Vaderian Low had the second longest arms of any tackle taken. That clearly the biomechanics of just like getting your hands on a guy, that reach mattered a lot to them. It also mattered. Length also mattered to them in the secondary. Like Cine was one of the longer armed corners, especially in comparison to this draft class. Or Booth had longer arms, especially compared to this draft class. Cine had very long arms as well. Obviously, the trench guys, it matters to them, but Asamoah as well. Like Asamoah's a skinny guy, but he's got like long arms too. So all these like kind of a lot of these lanky guys. Evans, probably one of the more standout, like really long arms for his size 6'2", like 32, 33 arms or something. So these are just long guys. So and I think that not just the metrics, but also the type of players they want to get are guys who play through the ball on defense. Like all these guys, all these secondary guys, there's something in common. Is they're explosive, they trigger hard, and they play through the ball. They've got good. I don't know if you necessarily call it ball skills. Like Andrew Booth was like an interception machine, but like Cine and Evans didn't have. I think they had 1 interception. Evans had like 1 career interception. Cine had like 2 or something. Not a lot of like interception production, but they got a lot of pass breakups because of how well they play the ball. So that was kind of something interesting I thought in terms of like overarching. Well, where are they allocating the draft capital? The secondary. What metrics do they care about? 10-yard split. Which ones do they don't not care about? Age. Unlike Andrew Berry, they didn't really care about age. They took a lot of older prospects, especially later on. So yeah, it was really interesting to finally see like, okay, analytics guru, how is this going to be different from Rick Spielman? It was similar in some ways and different in a lot of other ways. I don't know what other sort of overarching thoughts do you have on this class?
Yeah, no, I think that playing through the ball and the general explosiveness and the triggering downhill is probably the key, right? I think I tweeted this out that we have probably the most aggressive run defensive back group in the NFL right now. Assuming both Booth and Scene are starters, because Booth and Scene are incredibly aggressive downhill as run defenders. Like you can tell that they really turn on the jets. They have that explosion and they do it. They're a little bit out of control sometimes. And I think that leads to some tackling issues that need to be cleaned up with both of the players. And we'll get into that a little bit later, but you add Harrison Smith to that mix, right? Of like, the traditional downhill, like knows exactly where it's supposed to be, is very explosive in the backfield, especially, in Mike Zimmer's scheme where he played along the line of scrimmage like relatively often, right? He was able to do that knifing in the backfield and play downhill, be aggressive in the run game. I think we really have an aggressive set of players there, and that's kind of really exciting for the Vikings moving forward. I think we'll be making some plays closer to the line of scrimmage, and that was for sure an issue with us last year, right? Last year, we kind of had an issue where we would allow checkdowns to regularly go for like 6-7 yards, become positive games for the opposing team, and then we really struggled to get off the field after that. So that's something that I'm kind of looking forward to with this new group of players. Obviously, it can lead to some issues. The length in general is a big one. Like, none of these are small, undersized players that we were getting, with the exception of, I guess Asamoah is not the biggest from a weight perspective or a height perspective, but he's got the length to make up for that, right? So he's a little bit undersized in terms of a frame, but he does have a length. Ed Ingram, not the biggest guard in the world, but he doesn't play like an undersized player, right? So, and that's actually another interesting thing, is kind of the shift in the offensive linemen that we're looking for. So it was mentioned by one of the scouts, I believe, that the team is looking for more mid-zone players than wide zone, which is what the previous regime looked for. So mid-zone is slightly different in that the landmarks aren't as wide as wide zone, where wide zone, your first step really needs to be explosive, bursty to the outside or to whatever direction you're going. Mid zone, it doesn't need to be as explosive, and therefore a player like Ed Ingram or Vaderian Low, who are not that explosive with the first step, right? That's something you mentioned, that they didn't quite live up to that compared to the others, or they just don't have that general athleticism that a Garrett Bradbury, who's like a super, super athlete, right, has. They don't need that as much in this new system that we're running, which, again, it's still zone running. You still have similar reads and keys. It's just the aiming points are different, ultimately. And I shouldn't say that. You do have slightly different reads and stuff as well. Maybe that's something we can get into as we go later into the offseason, right, when we run out of stuff to talk about. But for right now, I think that shift in the offensive lineman is pretty interesting. And then just taking guys who are maybe more athletic and developmental, I think is kind of an interesting point, more than known quantities, is probably something we did. But if we flip that moving forward, one of the overarching themes of the draft as well were the trades that Kwesi was willing to make, right? And I think you really kind of need to separate it into day one trades and day two trades, because they're kind of separate entities, right? The day one trades were very pointed and one was a trade back, but then the combination of trades in the second round was for specific player, right? In terms of Andrew Booth, and to get additional capital in the second round. So if we break it down, they made 3 trades, right? The two Vikings fans care about the most, right, are the Lions trade and the Packers trade. The Lions trade, we traded down from 12. We picked up 32, 34, and 66, and we also sent the Lions 46. And then the Packers trade, we used the 34 that we got to the Lions to trade for 2 second-round picks, which were 53 and 59 from the Packers. We add in the Colts trade. which we moved up from 53. It cost us 77 and I believe 192 to get up to 42. So if you go ahead and look at the overall effects of the trade, right? Of the trades, because I think we can talk about them individually and then we can talk about them overall. The overall effects of the trades were basically the Vikings went from 12 to getting 32. I'm sorry, the Vikings spent 12, 46, 77, and 192, which were their first, second, third, and one of their 6th-round picks. And they received 32, the last pick in the first round, 42, 59, 42 and 59 are 2nd-round picks, 66, and they also received 122, which is a 4th-round pick. So they got 2 seconds, a very early 3rd, a late 1st, and a 4th in those results. There are a number of different ways you can kind of look at the trades from an analytical perspective, in terms of just trade charts that exist, right? And there are kind of, I guess I'll say, 5, overall trade charts that players have. So the biggest trade charts are the traditional one that draft media uses is the Jimmy Johnson chart. This is like Daniel Jeremiah, right? Head coverage for NFL Network. You'll hear him reference this a lot. I don't love the Jimmy Johnson chart. It's pretty outdated in terms of what it does. The more interesting one is is the Rich Hill chart. Looking at referencing something else. But the Rich Hill chart is interesting because it gives you the overall what teams have done in the past, right? So it provides you with the market value of all of the picks that have been traded in the past, and it's based off of historical NFL data. And the data I actually have for the Rich Hill chart that I'm going to give you in a second here is not the current data. He apparently updated recently, and I was using an outdated set, but that's okay. The point still remains, it's relatively close to what he has. There are also 3 other charts. AV, which was done by Chase Stewart back in the day, looks at historically how draft picks have performed at certain positions. Fitzgerald Spielberger looks at how draft picks have performed at certain positions in terms of getting second contracts at those positions. And then PFF WAR, which is based off of PFF's WAR, what they expect for certain picks at those points. So if you look at the charts overall, the Vikings lost on Rich Hill and Jimmy Johnson, and they won on the outcomes-based ones. Now, Kwesi has talked about how he specifically, has his own draft chart that he partly developed with the Browns. I imagine that Kwesi's draft chart is more outcomes-based than it is market-based, right? And that's why he was comfortable making the trades that he did. Because when you're trading down, you pretty much always win in the outcomes-based trades, and you don't necessarily win in the market trades. Given Kwesi's background, I think he cares more about the outcomes than the market. With that being said, sorry, that was a long introduction to this, right? But overall, if you look at the trade charts, Jimmy Johnson, we lost about 9% value for the Jimmy Johnson charts for those 3 trades. We lost the Detroit trade pretty heavily. We won the Green Bay trade handily, and we slightly lost the Indianapolis trade. Trading up, you're probably going to lose value. Rich Hill, similar story. We lost the Detroit trade. We lost it by 8%, so it's not that bad. We won the Green Bay trade by 12%, and we lost the Indianapolis trade by like 3%, for a total of, we lost about 4% on the Rich Hill chart. However, overall, we gained 18% on the Chase Stewart chart, we gained 20% on the Fitzgerald Spielberger chart, and we gained about 10% on the PFF chart with those 3 trades. And in those cases, we won both of the trades up, and we lost the trade down. Those trades just prefer that you trade down. Like that's pretty much the characteristic of those charts. Based on outcomes, more shots as the apple is probably better with the way the draft works. So ultimately, you look at it from that perspective, and we probably won the combination of trades. I know you and I both like the pair of players that we picked up, so I'm pretty happy with the outcome overall. But I don't know if you want to talk about it here and roll it into, okay, we gave both Detroit and Green Bay a wide receiver. How do you think that impacts us, and how do you think that impacts the calculus for making the trades?
Yeah, it was really interesting actually hearing Kwesi address those questions in his post-draft pressers. And one of the things talking about all the charts, it's so funny. Kwesi was like, "Well, one thing." He was like, "I'm an economist, and as everybody knows, there's the famous Economist paper by Richard Thaler back in the 2000s. This is what's funny about the Jimmy Johnson charts. Is not only has it been outdated for 30 years, we've known it's been outdated for at least 20 years because the Thaler article came out in the 2000s. There's an overconfidence priced into the early round picks, and teams overrate the value of first and second round picks earlier on in the drafts. They overvalue those picks because they're overconfident in their ability to pick out a Pro Bowler player. When it turns out that you're only marginally better in the first round finding future Pro Bowlers than in the second round, or in the third round, and so marginally at each round of the draft. So, but Kwesi was like, at the same time. I think some of the more analytical things, more analytical charts also overvalue like late round picks because we don't talk about the marginal value of a seventh. We don't talk about the marginal value of a draft picks. A lot of these charts value things in absolute terms. Like, look how many seventh rounders have become Pro Bowlers. Well, like the marginal benefit of a seventh rounder isn't a new player on your roster. It's replacing an undrafted free agent with a seventh rounder on your roster. Mm-hmm. So it's decent, but like in absolute terms, a seventh rounder is very valuable. But in the marginal terms between a seventh rounder and an undrafted free agent is actually very minimal. So that's why Kwesi said like no amount of seventh rounders could add up to the value of a first rounder because the first rounders are special players that you're not going to find anywhere else. You're not going to find them in free agency, and you're not going to find them in the draft. Or at least if you find first rounders in free agency, something went wrong. So. He was like, the truth is probably somewhere in between, and I try not to think too hard about like crunching the numbers. I try and do what's best for our team at that point. And so when the Vikings were sitting there, and the bet sounds like the best deal on the table is the Lions offer, which they understood was a bit of a low ball. They said, well, we can stay here, stand pat, and take Jameson Williams and hope somebody falls to us at 46. Or we can do this trade down, understanding we're taking a bit of a bath on the value, but we just see that there's so much value in the 30s and 40s of this draft class, and we're going to be able to pick up additional team needs. Kwesi interestingly said, like, we're not one great player away, we're several good players away, or several very good players away, and we think we can find those players later on. So you can criticize the pick for not getting more value. It's certainly true that when you look at historical precedent, even for non-QB trades, the Vikings could have gotten more, and most teams have gotten more in the past. At the same time, though, this was not a quarterback-heavy class. There were not a lot of people willing to trade up, especially trade up like first and second round picks, which is what the Lions were offering. Like, sure, something like the Eagles moved up, but they paid like a bunch of day 3 picks. Like the Vikings wanted something in like the 40s, 50s, those sort of premium picks. So, it's also so funny like. How you contextualize it makes it sound like if you say like, wow, the Lions only paid a third round pick to move up 20 spots in the first and in the second round, it sounds like the Vikings took a bath. Yeah. If you say, wow, the Vikings moved down 20 spots from their first and second pick and earned a first rounder in the process, that sounds pretty good for the Vikings. So it's part of it is also the context. So I think I like the move in a vacuum just because the analytics will tell you they got better outcomes. Like if you look at PFF wins above replacement, if you look at how these contracts typically play out, the Vikings were better off making the trade. The divisional rival thing is funny. I don't mind ripping off the Packers to give them, as Luke Braun calls him, FCS Troy Williamson. I have no issues giving them FCS Troy Williamson. Trading 2 first rounders for 1. That sounds like a pretty good. Like if you have to rip somebody off, you might as well rip off a divisional rival. The converse is also true though. If you're going to give somebody a premium, if you're going to take a cheap deal, better to not give it to a divisional rival in the Lions. So I think that's part of the consideration, but that's just such like it's not even a tertiary consideration. It's a quaternary. I don't even know the word for that, but it's not a concern about, how do we make this team better? Your first concern should be, how do we get good players for the Vikings? And if if you think you can get Lewis Cine and Andrew Booth for the price of Jameson Williams, that's a winning trade in my opinion. And obviously, it's a lot more complicated than that because actually the Vikings picked up. They traded up for Booth, but they also got Asamoah and they also got Ingram. So in the best case scenario, the Vikings got 4 players for 1 here. But
Yep.
It's the Vikings needed more than 1 player, and they didn't. They weren't just like 1 wide receiver away. If anything, a Jameson Williams pick is a cherry on top pick for a team that is coming off like an NFC Championship loss or something. That's not the Vikings right now. So I like what they did. I think it's still fair to criticize them for not getting better value, for not negotiating harder or whatever. We don't really know if there were better offers on the table or if this was Lions take it or leave it. But I'm happy with it, and it's really funny. It's really interesting seeing the disconnect because you'll see analytics guys like Eric Heger or Ben Baldwin. Ben Baldwin's like, man, the Lions took it like they were just destroyed on this trade, and I'm not. It's funny because like I don't even think Kwesi would agree with that. Like Kwesi talk about it's like, yeah, we get it, but
no.
So not to belabor the point, but yeah, I like what they did. I understand the criticisms, but I'm a fan of it.
Yeah, and one final point there is honestly like the questionability. I think the Detroit trade is very questionable in terms of the value that the Vikings got back. I think if you even it out, like it's an okay trade for them to make, but I guess my complaint with it is I don't think they negotiated very well, right? If you look at historically what teams receive for those sorts of trades, they did not get as much as they should get historically, right? They lost by almost 10% on the Rich Hill chart, right? That's a pretty significant amount. If you look at the trades that happened right next to their picks, right? Trades were at 11 and trades were at 13, right? Both of those picks were traded as well. They lost value on those charts compared to those trades. Now, those trades were different in scope, right? I believe 11 was Washington. They moved back 5 slots with New Orleans. 13 was Houston. They moved back just 2 slots with Philly, right? So there's a different level of a jump, right? And the other part of the conversation is, the Lions trading up and getting Jameson Williams there at 12. Well, you don't know what other teams were willing to trade up to that spot. But if the Lions were adamant about getting Jameson Williams, they probably would have been able to trade up to 13 with the Houston Texans or 14 or whatever, whenever he was going to come off the board. So I don't think the argument that, we gave the Lions Jameson Williams is really all that relevant for that situation. But it is important to realize that in the context of all of the trades that happened in the first round, the Vikings got the worst value return based on what has happened historically for that trade. So it's an important thing. But like to Ben Baldwin's point, they won the trade, right? From an analytical perspective, you can still do a better job negotiating. The analogy I used is if you have, say your phone or whatever is worth $100, right? That's the true value of your phone. But it's a nice color or something, everybody likes it, they're willing to pay $120. Like the market's willing to pay $120. If you sell your phone for $110, sure, you made money over the value of it, but you still didn't get as much money as you could have. That's the analogy with the Lions trade. The Packers trade, I think we pantsed them, and Christian Watson is not Christian Watson is not a ready to start NFL wide receiver, which is what the Packers needed to add to their offense to become more competitive this season. So I'm not too concerned about it. And we got a ton of value in return for it compared to any sort of market that you look at. So I think it was a great trade. So it's been a long-winded rant, I think, from both of us, but that's our perspective on the day 1 and 2 trades. And the Andrew Booth move, once you've already traded back twice, I think you can give up that capital to go get a player that you like that's falling, that's on a tier differential, and he was very clearly like that tier differential. It was either Alontae Taylor or Cam Taylor-Britt, who was the next cornerback taken, and neither of those are even close to the level of talent that Andrew Booth has. Like, Gordon, McCrary were already off the board. Like, we needed a corner. Moving up to make that pick makes total sense to me. If we go into the day 3 trades, it was a lot of, we traded back with the Raiders twice. It was kind of weird. One, I think we swapped 7th round picks or something. So we moved up in the 7th round. And then the other, we got a couple of 5th round picks for a 4th round pick. which, is similar to the move back with the Packers or something like that. The interesting trade to me is that we were willing to give up a future 4th round pick to go get our guy in a corner in a Caleb Evans, right? And we had 122, so it's not like we were all that far apart. But I think history kind of proved Kwesi right in the need to get up there immediately, because the Ravens took a corner at 119, and there was another corner taken at 121, I believe, by the Patriots right after Jack Jones. It was either 120 or 121. So while the Vikings were at 122, 118, if somebody else was trying to get up there, or the Browns, who were originally in the spot, were interested in a corner, and I do believe they took a corner later in the draft as well, it was the right move to get up there ahead of it. Now, sending a future 4th round pick is a lot of value to send in that scenario, because we also sent a 5th round pick along with it. So I just thought it was kind of interesting from an analytical perspective on the GM to send a future pick like that. Any further thoughts on that, Nick?
Yeah, they took a bath by any trade chart on the Caleb Evans trade, but just clearly they are sky high, and they're not they're not hiding the fact that they are sky high on a Caleb Evans and what they think he can be. It sounds like they had as high as like a late 1st, early 2nd round grade on the guy, and they were able to get him all the way in the middle of the 4th round. So when you are that confident in your evaluation to go up and trade for guys, like, yeah, I think that's sometimes you pay a premium, but I don't think many people regret that the Vikings traded up for Harrison Smith right now. Like, that one kind of worked out. So a lot of times when you trade up for those guys, it ends up working out. I mean, Kwesi traded up for JOK last year. That kind of worked out pretty well for Cleveland. So it's an overpay, but if they are correct in their assessment of how good Evans can be and what the coaches believe Evans can be, then I don't think we're going to be bemoaning a future 4th if this guy turns into be a starting boundary corner. So if you have to, you can't be overconfident in your own evaluations. So that's my one caveat there, is like, okay, sure, you guys have a 1st round grade on him, but what are you seeing that Dane Brugler isn't? What are you seeing that Lance Zierlein isn't? So that's part of it too. So have some humility in your own evaluations, but man, like they were just sky high on this guy. So him in particular, I'm interested to really dive in more to his tape and see what exactly they are so enamored with there. So, but otherwise, the trade down with the Raiders, I think, those are wins. You get up a little bit more draft capital, you move down 2 spots and move up 20 spots in the 7th. Seems like a win to me. So, especially when it seems like they didn't have anybody in particular they had on their board that they needed. So, and then they wound up getting like two fifths back for.
Yeah, it was 165 and 129 for like 169 for 127 or something at that point.
126, yeah. So that's like the Packers trade just a little bit later on. So that's a coup of value. So I'm very happy with all the trade downs. I can understand the criticism, except I understand the criticism of the Lions one. The trade ups were expensive, but in Booth's case, I have zero concern because I'm extremely high on Booth, and in Evans' case, they are extremely high on Evans. So, and corner's a premium position, so I don't mind trading up for a premium position. So,
yeah, and I guess the last thing I want to touch on for the trades before we get into the individual players is, let's say we alternate universe this a little bit, right? And the Vikings don't trade out of the 1st round. Let's say they take a safety at 12. That would be Kyle Hamilton, who is still on the board at that point. At 46, there's one of 2 options. They're probably able to move up to get Andrew Booth as he's falling, right? That's like a legitimate possibility that could happen. The other option is they stick at 46 and they take the second best corner, like Cam Taylor-Britt or something like that, which I don't think is a great pick. At 77, Brian Asamoah is not there. Maybe it's Chad Muma who they take, right? And then they don't have a 4th round pick, so they don't get a Caleb Evans. And into the 5th round pick, they're on to Asezi Otomow. Otomow. Jesus.
It's Nigerian. It's like each phoneme is exactly the same. Otomow. It's
Otomow. Yeah,
you'll get used to it. Otomow.
Yeah, man, that was 3 times. That's very rough. That's very rough. So, let's say Kyle Hamilton, Cam Taylor-Britt, and neither of Ed Ingram, Brian Asamoah. You got Chad Muma instead of linebacker. Which do you prefer?
Yeah, I mean, give me Cena Booth and all the
Yeah,
other
absolutely.
depth that this roster needs, right? So
100%.
we're not. This is what Quasi was saying. This is what we've been saying. We're not one blue chip away. We're not one Kyle Hamilton from a Super Bowl run. Give us the depth. Give us. I mean, we'll talk about these guys, but if we have a chance to fill a hole and get a solid starting guard and a solid replacement for Eric Kendricks and a good starting cornerback and a good starting safety at the cost, instead of having a potentially blue chip safety prospect who may or may not pan out anyway in the same way any of these picks do. So yeah, give me more bites at the apple.
Yeah. So I'm 100% on board. And with talking about that, let's get into Lewis Cine. Obviously, there was a lot of talk about Kyle Hamilton going to the Vikings. Not an F1 driver, notably. But no, so we had, there was a lot of talk about him. We just mentioned him. Very solid player. We think is going to be a quality starter for a long time. Has the upside to be an excellent player. I think Lewis Cine maybe has a lower percentage to be a very good starter for a long time because of some issues. He's not quite as clean of a prospect as Kyle Hamilton, but I think he pretty much has the exact same upside that Kyle Hamilton does in terms of the ability to turn into an elite player. And I think he's still a very good player right now. I said before the draft on this podcast, right, that he is a player who I don't think is as far from Kyle Hamilton as we're kind of giving Hamilton credit for. Like, I thought he was a fine, pick in the 20s, trade back a little bit from 12, and in desperation when none of our guys are there, he's somebody I would have considered picking in that spot, along with Andrew Booth Jr. and maybe some of the other corners that were available, right? So, ultimately, I really like the pick. I haven't gotten all the way through my tape work yet, but I am going to give my preliminary scouting report here. I know you've gotten a lot further through your tape work, so you can correct anything I get wrong, or we can just have a discussion about it. So the first thing you notice about Lewis Cine is that explosion numbers, that explosiveness that you talked about shows up on tape immediately. You see it in run defense. You see it against screens. Like, he screams downhill fast. He's meeting guys when he's coming downhill. He's starting at like 12 to 14 yards of depth, typically as a safety in that Georgia defense. He is meeting guys on screen plays at the line of scrimmage, 1 to 2 yards past the line of scrimmage on both screen plays and run games. That explosion is there. He meets guys. I think he takes good angles and is cognizant of his fit in those situations. He's cognizant of where the blockers are, where the other defenders are, and where he needs to be to best make the tackle. I think his tackling form isn't great. It's been talked about a lot, I think, but he tackles high, right? And people have talked about that in terms of concern with penalties. I don't know if he got a whole lot of penalties at the college level, and they're more aggressive about penalizing targeting and that sort of thing than they are at the NFL level, I believe. So at the end of the day, I'm not so concerned about it from a penalty perspective, but from a wrapping up and tackling technique perspective, I am a little bit concerned about it because he can get dragged a few yards by guys. Like, he is on the lighter end. He hits hard, but he doesn't necessarily quite have the hitting power that maybe you'd like to see. It's maybe a little bit of a Cam Dantzler situation where it hurts when he hits you, but he's not necessarily bringing you down. So that tackling high leads to issues wrapping up. I don't think it's like a technical issue with like he doesn't attempt to wrap guys. It's that he's aiming at the wrong area when he's attempting to wrap guys, and it leads to guys leading there. But regardless, his ability to attack downhill also allows him to funnel players to other defenders, right? Which is a key part of like team tackling and that sort of thing. Like, and the Georgia defense is phenomenal, first of all, right? I mean, Georgia had 15 players go, and probably 11 of them were defensive players in the draft, right? They had multiple first round picks, and Nakobe Dean, who should have been a first round pick, probably fell due to injury, at the end of the day. So they had phenomenal talent on that defense, but he fit in very well, and he allowed that talent to shine with what he was doing on the defensive end, I believe. So flipping over, I talked about run defense a little bit. I think he was very helpful and very good in the box on that side. Also, on the coverage side, I think he did a lot of things that he's going to be asked to do in the Vikings. Kirby Smart, as the head coach, runs the defense at Georgia. He's a Nick Saban disciple. So in his time with Nick Saban there, he runs almost identical concepts, and he has seen to do a variety of things on the defensive end. So first of all, he's in deep half coverage. There are some times where he's in deep third coverage. They actually like to play kind of 3 safety sets where Scene was down in the box at linebacker level. And when they were using him in coverage, they'd use him as a Tampa runner, essentially a Tampa 2 runner. That's something we do with Eric Kendricks a lot. They'd also use him as a blitzer in that. So he was very versatile in terms of what he did in the passing game. He was also sometimes pulled down into the slot for man coverage, specifically on tight ends. From a man coverage perspective, and there were some people after day one talking about potentially moving Lewis Cine to corner. I think with drafting Andrew Booth in the second round, that's not even something that we're considering in the first place, and the additional drafting of Caleb Evans. Second of all, I don't think he profiles very well as a corner. I think he's relatively tight-hipped more tight-hipped than you'd want for a cornerback. There are some pretty notable plays where he just doesn't have the movement capability to cover guys in man coverage who are maybe going to be shiftier. With that being said, I think he does have the capability, the physicality, and the athletic ability to match up against tight ends in man coverage, which is the main thing you're asking safeties to do. I'm not going to say he's perfect at it, but he can work on the vertical stem. He can work against digs. He can cover tight ends in the passing game when you move him into the slot over that. And I think that gives him some versatility in 3 tight end sets for the Vikings. Half field coverage, I think he's got good instincts. I think he reads the quarterback's intentions well, and I think he reads out what's happening in front of him well. I actually kind of like his ball skills. We mentioned a little bit earlier. Like, he has an understanding of how to get his hand in there to break up passes. He's maybe not, the best catcher in the world, right? But he knows where the ball is and has the ability to get it out. In the Clemson game, which was their first game of the season, he made a critical stop on third down where he punched the ball out after the player had functionally caught it to basically end that game. And that was a difficult covered situation where he was kind of lined up over the slot. It was a rub route from the offense, so it got the guy a little bit of separation, but he was able to punch the ball out, make the play, and end the game. There were a couple instances where he allowed catches on the sideline in terms of half-field coverage. I think that what they asked him to do in those instances were kind of it took a really good throw from the quarterback to be able to complete that pass. Also in deep coverage, he totally has the ability and the speed to keep with guys deep on the vertical stem. There was a really nice deep post that I think he came around and covered as a deep safety from across the field in a 3-by-1 or a 2-person formation. So I think there's a lot of things that he did in coverage that profile well from the Vikings. Especially, and there was one coming downhill on a crosser and a dig against over the middle, right? And I think a lot of that stuff profiles well for the Vikings. So I liked him a lot in coverage. I think while he's not, intercepting a ton of passes, his speed is there. He's somewhat limited in things, and tackling maybe is my biggest concern for him overall as a player. Do you have anything else on Scene that you'd like to add there, Nick, or just a general scouting report?
Yeah, I guess I'd push back on a few things. I would say the tackling high issue is overrated. I think there was one notable instance where he kind of got trucked or carried a little bit by the Bama receiver in the national championship game, and he did tackle high on that instance. But I mean, this is a guy who led the Georgia defense in tackles, like that star-studded defense. There aren't very many other examples of him getting. I mean, there are some examples of him tackling high, but most of the time he's good at lowering his shoulder and driving through the hips. Or at the very least, driving through the chest. You probably can get him a little bit lower. I think the main issue when you see him not have enough stopping power is just he's light, and that's probably my biggest weakness for him. Is he's lanky. He is a light 200 pounds on like a 6'2" plus frame. So and long arms. So he's just like kind of a lanky guy. He reminds me a little bit of who's that former Jags, then former Bengals, then. Former Viking, Reggie Nelson safety, just like a lightweight, but hits hard, good coverage player. So yeah, I'm the other thing I guess I would push back on a little bit is I kind of at first I thought I agreed that his hips are a little tight, but then after watching a few plays, I've seen him make some very, very fluid speed turns and zone turns that both make me think like it's not a hips issue. I think his main issue in coverage is especially when he's like in man coverage or like zone coverage, but functionally man coverage where his eyes are on his man, and he has to react to the route. He can be a little bit late to react to advanced route runners, or even like solid college route runners, where he'll take a split second to react, and that will make him late, and so his hips will not turn as tightly as athletically I know he's capable of from other plays seeing him do. So that's kind of where I would. I would say his weaknesses are, and I would say his main weakness is just in general he's got an over aggression to him, and that serves him very well when he's coming down into the fit in the run game. Which is, by the way, hugely important for this quarters scheme we're going to be running, because if you want to have a safety in the fit coming from 15 yards depth, like hitting his landmark and then coming down, you need one who, one, has really great burst, and two, is really confident in his read to trigger downhill. So, and Scene has that. So you ask about, well, why spend a first-round pick on a safety? Well, in this scheme, it's a little bit more of a premium position than in like a cover two scheme. So I would say so his overaggression can serve him well, but a lot of times, especially with the angles he takes, he'll come down too hot, and he'll miss tackles, or he'll have to he'll run down and then make a funny turn at the last second trying to catch back up to the guy because he took too hard of an angle. So that's a fixable issue, a coachable issue. Just like tell him to run to where the receiver will be rather than where the receiver is. Or run to where the ball will be rather than where the ball you think the ball is. So have a little bit more respect. But I echo all the strengths you're saying. I think he's an elite athlete. I mean, we're talking about one of the best athletic testers at the combine at the safety position. Certainly the best 10-yard split. Great size. I mean, if you take out, he's a little undersized in the weight category, but great frame, great length, which he uses very well, disrupting the ball. Getting on the ball. I think he has the potential to be a good man coverage slot defender down the line. I wouldn't put him there because he's going to have his head swimming with all the safety stuff he's going to have to learn. And I think his traits are best, like that burst, that length, that ability to make play with the ball, that ability to fit into the run. That's more valuable at safety than at corner. So I think he's more valuable there. But for matchup specific things, or if you want to be able to, if you think your best five includes Bynum and Scene, and you want to just try them all out, that's a possibility as well. So I will say, before I trust him in man coverage, I think he needs to get better at more instinctively and immediately reacting to route stems and route breaks. I think that was an area he struggled. He had flashes where he did really well, but he also had a lot of plays where things didn't go too well for him. So high traits guy, high ceiling guy. It's funny you mentioned him having as high of a ceiling than Kyle Hamilton. I think he clearly has a higher ceiling than Kyle Hamilton. I think Kyle Hamilton's a better prospect, but Kyle Hamilton ran a 4.640 and then a 4.7 at his pro day. Lewis Scene ran a sub 4.440, and it's just offers so many other things athletically with what he does. And he's the gap between how smart Kyle Hamilton is and how smart Lewis Scene is smaller than you think. So he's just a fun player to watch. If you want more thoughts on Lewis Scene, I did a full 4,000 word breakdown with over 100 clips on zone coverage right now. So if you go to zone coverage, you'll be able to see that article there and get my full thoughts. If this 5-minute monologue isn't enough for you, it's if you just go to Nicholson NFL on Twitter, it's my pinned tweet right now. So that's where you can find it. But yeah, I'm really excited about Scene. I think he's a day one starter. I think he has a chance to be a plus starter as a rookie. I think he's got an elite ceiling. So I'm really excited about the everything he brings to the table. I think he brings a lot of physicality, violence, but also smarts and ball skills as well. So kind of a lot of what you want in this kind of quarter style defense that we're trying to build here.
No, so perfect. So one question I have that pulled out there, and maybe you don't remember this, but it's something that I'll definitely watch for. You said he's over-aggressive, coming downhill in some instances. In coverage, did you see them get beat over the top because he drove on something underneath at all, or on occasion?
There were a couple instances where, a slot fade, he would be either late to break or he wouldn't take... he would think he would get to them, 15 yards down the field, and the ball arrives at 18 yards down the field, and he has to turn upfield, and then he has to tackle them from behind instead of being able to make a play at the catch point. So there were a couple one of those. It's He's better with his angles when he's like chasing a receiver upfield, when he's turning his hips and running. He's worse at it when he's playing downhill. So when it comes to he's the worst instances are when like he was in like he lined up so much as the boundary safety in Georgia's defense and Kirby Smart's defense, and when he like would trigger downhill to a guy getting a screen in the flat or something. That would be where you'd see like bad instances of him like just like completely missing, like not even getting a hand on the guy because he took too hard of an angle. So there are a couple instances of that. That's something you have to clean up, especially because all your problems in college football are going to be magnified against NFL competition. There's that. He's better at it, like triggering downhill on like a dig route. I can't remember him misreading that ever. So he's actually really, a lot of his pass breakups came on triggering downhill on like dig routes or in routes or other crossing routes. So
and that's awesome because that's a critical part of playing quarter safety, and that cover or quarter half safety, right? The cover 6 safety in the defense. So I think that's a really key part of playing covers in that defense, and seeing him do it at Georgia and be effective and not misreading it, I think it is critical, even if he has some other places he needs to clean up in terms of instinctively what he's doing.
The other thing, just on that point, like I've seen him knocked, or some people ask questions like, if he's so good, he profiles as such a rangy ball hockey safety, why didn't he have more like playmaking production? He had 1 interception over the last 2 years, and I think that's an interesting question. When I went back and actually watched all his snaps, I can count on there's maybe 1 or 2 interceptions that you could argue he should have caught. None of them would have been easy. One, he got his hands on them. It was like he was kind of almost he was able to undercut the route from like a too high alignment, and it was an end zone corner. So he was able to like cut under it and get into the ball path, and he got his fingertips on it. He jumped up, he got he got his fingertips on it, but he wasn't able to come down with it. I was just impressed he was able to get his hands on the ball. The other instance is when he was mid-pointing the quarterback on a rollout and the flat defender, and he was able to sort of like jump up and knock the ball out. I mean, if you're an elite defender, you could catch those. But otherwise, like, I think there weren't a lot of instances on tape where you saw him like, oh, this is why he's playing safety and not wide receiver, because his hands are terrible. There just weren't many opportunities, because so often, especially from that quarters alignment or that too high alignment that he did so much at Georgia, he just didn't have a lot of instances where he was able to like be in a position to make an interception. So he'll get a lot more opportunities for that with the way the quarters system is designed to let you do those poach things and those cone things and those, drive down on routes and steal and rob coverages away. So I'm not concerned at all about his playmaking. Sorry, just a long footnote on.
No. Absolutely. So that's Lewis Scene. We got a full breakdown there. For Andrew Booth Jr., I think we're going to go a little bit quicker this time. We did a pretty full breakdown of Booth Jr., 3 or 4 episodes ago. Nick and I both tweeted out clips from what we talked about there. They're on our Twitter timelines. If you go back to the cornerback episode of this podcast, you'll hear our full breakdowns of Andrew Booth Jr. in that instance. Just real quick with him, obviously, he did not do athletic testing at the combine. He had an injury during the season, and then he also had hernia surgery after the season. So he has not done any athletic testing through the process. Obviously, the Vikings would have to approximate based off of GPS data, which it sounds like they did. And Kwesi's like, it's not the best model in the world, but we're doing what we can in this instance, right? And they like what they see on tape. Obviously, we both like what we see on tape. I think he's a press man corner first. Like, I think he has clear press man capabilities. I think he's got good, not stellar athletic ability. But what I loved most about him, I loved his run defense attitude. And then I also loved the variety of roles he was tasked with at Clemson. I think it really mirrors what we have in our offense. Just whatever you have quick to add for Andrew Booth, Nick.
Yeah, again, we went in a lot more depth before we drafted him, and I think that's probably an even better thing to look at, because it's not, there's no purple tinted glasses here, because we were high on him just based on his Clemson tape back then. It's interesting. I agree. He's a good, not elite athlete. I would say, though, he has elite explosion. He's just part of it is he's very, very, you talk about Scene being aggressive. Booth is even more aggressive. Booth is like one of the most aggressive players I've scouted, just because when he sees ball, he like triggers like a bat out of hell. So And part of that is a quick trigger and good instincts, and part of that is like, man, he's like, if you're trying to estimate his 10-yard split or whatever, or his jumps, his broad jump, his vertical, I think those would all be through the roof, even if his agility drills and his flying 20s, the back end of his 40-yard dash, or more pedestrian. So great, incredible ball skills. In a lot of ways, he's like a discount Stingley. You even got like the injury concerns with him as well, just in terms of like the playmaking, the ball skills, and some crazy interceptions. The highlights are insane, but also the low lights are bad. I think him and Stingley share those concerns. I would say the other thing with Booth is I think he's a day one starter, but he's got a lot to clean up in terms of like route anticipation, in terms of just sort of a feel for coverages. Like, don't get me wrong, he has lots of great plays, but it's not hard to imagine Booth having a rough rookie season because he's not ready for NFL route runners. So you just see him bite on a lot of things. That aggression, again, comes back to bite him. So I think that camp competition between him and, I assume it'll be Dantzler, although in a theory you could see Dantzler and Booth starting and Patrick Peterson being in the rotational role. I wouldn't guess it, but maybe if he falls off. It'll be interesting anyway to see, because I think they've got three starting caliber corners on the boundary corners on the roster now. So that'll be a really fun competition, because I'm pretty high on Booth's ability. It's just a matter of him putting it together and getting more consistency and eliminating the bad plays.
Yeah, if I had to place a bet right now, I'd say your day one starting outside corners were Patrick Peterson and Andrew Booth Jr. I think from a physical perspective, Booth offers you a lot more, and I don't think he's that far off from being a starting NFL player, even with a couple of the deficiencies that you just mentioned. So I think that even if he gets got a couple times, it's not like that hasn't happened to Cam Dantzler before, so... it'll be
everybody remembers that Lions game, or did we shut that out of our memory?
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what the camp battle is nonetheless there. And let's move on to our third pick. At number 59 overall, we selected guard Ed Ingram out of LSU. One thing I want to get into just prior to talking about Ed Ingram, the player, is, there are significant off-field question marks with Ed Ingram, the person. At LSU in 2019, he was charged for incidents that allegedly happened while he was a teenager, 15 or 16, that in the state of Texas, which is where he's from, for sexual assault of a minor. Obviously, he was also a minor at that point, but that doesn't really, impact the story all that much. So the charges were dropped. But there is a Deadspin article that has pretty graphic detail in terms of the charges, if it's something you want to research more on. Luke Braun, on his podcast, Locked On Vikings, also went into pretty significant detail. Norse Code with Arif Hassan and James Skoshnik also went into very significant detail. And Arif really pressed Kwesi in the press conference on the draft selection of Ed Ingram, given the context of this situation. Obviously, it's pretty severe. The allegations are pretty severe. Unfortunately, we as the public had no real way to have great research into the allegations, or really have a way to come to a determination on whether or not, how we feel about it individually, right? There's just not enough information for anybody to really read into this. So it's, and Ed Ingram refused to answer questions about it. Basically, he said he didn't want to talk about it. Kwesi basically refused to answer questions about the incident in terms of any sort of details of what the situation was. So it's a major question mark with Ed Ingram, right? I don't know I don't think it really means, an issue with the Vikings, right? He missed the 2018 season in LSU. And that's the only thing he's had. There's no indication the NFL is going to do anything about it. I don't know if it's going to be an issue for him moving forward in his NFL career, but it's something about him that's outside of the football field that kind of matters when you're talking about the draft picking context, right? So with that talked about, right, and it's relevant for the draft pick because this is a high investment in a player. We can talk about the player. Ed Ingram, the guard, is a little bit of a transition. I talked about this earlier from the players the Vikings have drafted previously, right? He's not a super athlete. He's a pretty middling athlete. honestly, just in terms of his athletic testing. At 306 pounds, he's not light, but he's not a heavy mauling player either. So it's kind of an interesting dichotomy there, where he's not a great athlete, and also he's probably about the weight range of all the players we complain about not being strong enough. That being said, I haven't watched a significant amount of him, to be honest with you, and we'll dig more into that later. But based on scouting reports, he's a relatively powerful player, particularly for his size. In particular, it's called out that he's a great puller as a blocker and a great pass protector. I think is really his calling card. Which, if you hear great pass protector for the Vikings, especially at guard, that's a welcome change from what we've had previously in terms of just the skill set there, right? Obviously, we've gone through Dakota Dozier and Oliuda starting the past 2 years, and Drew Samia even the year before as well. So it's just been a roller coaster in terms of pass protection on this offensive line, and that's something that's really hurt Kirk Cousins' ability to succeed, is that interior pressure. So he's someone that will be in strong competition for the guard position. Obviously, we've added 2 other players in terms of Jesse Davis and Austin Schlottman. It sounds like Chris Reed might get a chance to compete at center with Garrett Bradbury is the plan for Chris Reed. So any more addition there on Ed Ingram, Nick?
Yeah, I guess I don't want to belabor the point on the sexual assault allegations, but the one thing I would just add is it's tough because he was a teenager when the alleged assault happened. Assaults, plural, because he's alleged to have done this over a course of time to 2 sisters who were under the age of 14 at the time of the assault, both of them. So presumably one younger than the other. You don't want to presume guilt, but at the same time, I think so much of the facts just point in that direction. I don't want to say anything about the guy, but especially when in the view of the court of law, he's innocent. But he was arrested. That usually doesn't happen without probable cause. He was indicted. The last Vikings organization cut their first-round pick, Jeff Gladney, when he was indicted by a grand jury. Ed Ingram was indicted by a grand jury. They found there was enough evidence that if proven in a court of law, he would be able to be charged with aggravated sexual assault of a minor, which, by the way, is basically rape. It's just that some jurisdictions don't call it rape; they call it aggravated sexual assault. So
to be clear, Texas law states that sexual assault includes penetration. Like, that's part of the definition, which is functionally rape.
Yeah, and that's part of what the alleged indictment included. So just the gravest sexual criminal offenses, basically, that our system permits, and they went to trial with it. And then the accusers decided not to testify, and they dropped the case. So, and accusers can agree not to testify for a lot of reasons. Maybe you don't want to spend months in court. Maybe you don't want to be in the same room as your accuser. Maybe you don't think it's worth reliving the trauma, or maybe it was all made up, or maybe this was like a joke that went too far. Or it's tough being in this gray area of having no idea what's going on. And it was disappointing for me hearing Kwesi be so evasive and hearing Ed Ingram be so evasive. Like, I think Kevin Seifert asked Ed Ingram and his presser, like, basically, did you do it? And Ed Ingram was like, he didn't say, like, no, I'm innocent. He said, I don't want to talk about it. He said, I just want to enjoy which is like, I get that you're a kid and I don't expect you to have PR training, but that's not the best answer, man. And then Kwesi just refused to answer the question. So, again, fans have listened to it so much at this point. He was a teenager at the time it happened. It's just a bummer, especially after everything that we saw with Cleveland this year, to now be dealing with that with our own team. So off-field the issues aside, the other thing is this was 7 years ago, so this was also, he's probably not the same person he was at 15. I know I'm a very different person than I was at 15. So at the same time, it's aggravated sexual assault. So it's
a really
and to address.
Just to get in here as well, it's a really complicated issue, and it's hard to reckon with. But I agree with you that the very frustrating part is the team and he just kind of refuse to address it, right? So we don't have anything to say that this is what they believe, right? Like, we don't have. It's not the team believes that he's innocent. It's not that he's even claiming that he's innocent, it's, well, that's not relevant. We're just going to move past it. When I think it is very relevant. I mean, we've spent how long talking about Deshaun Watson in the media, and frankly, I don't think the Browns handled the Deshaun Watson issue, where we have kind of more detail. I don't think they handled that very well. I would have been very upset if I'm a Cleveland Browns fan, or if the Minnesota Vikings had traded for Deshaun Watson, right? And given the answers that the Cleveland Browns did. And I think for me personally as well, it's upsetting that this is the response that the organization is going to give. Now, this is something that I have to reckon with my personal thing, right? It's not as high impact of a player as Deshaun Watson, and my brain, for whatever reason, man, I'm really struggling to root for the Vikings right now for whatever reason, right? So it's not going to change the scope of what I'm talking about on this podcast, but it's just a difficult situation to grasp and kind of come to terms with, I think, because they're not even allowing us any information to be able to come to terms with it.
Yeah, I mean, this is the first time I was really disappointed to hear Kwesi talk about something presser. And, he got a lot of really good questions from the media and responded to each of them. Was like, I appreciate why you have to ask that question, but we did a lot of research. We're very comfortable with the player. And that's all I'm going to say about it. So it was just disappointing. As to the player himself, because like it or not, the justice system has moved on and the team is moving on. And honestly, call me cynical, but fans will probably move on too. I like the player. I like the flashes. I wouldn't have taken. He's not the guard I would have taken. In part because I didn't see him as a scheme fit, or at least the best scheme fit, and in part because I thought there were better players on the board at the time. So I didn't really like the value. Spending a second round guy on a guy who kind of was maybe more of like a late third rounder, early fourth rounder. Didn't love that value. Maybe if you evaluate his tape only, you think he's actually a second rounder, and the Vikings just were comfortable very much with his legal issues that they said, I think, is a second round player, and so we're going to discount those legal issues because we know that they're not an issue anymore. Then that's fine. But I would say the best thing about him is his pass protection. Well, his calling card, I guess, is his power and the run game, and especially as a puller, heavy-handed. And I would say the best thing about him in pass protection is that, and the thing that makes me most excited about his play on the field is that he's very good at staying square or maintaining the proper inside leverage with a defensive tackle across from him. And basically, he's very good at keeping his feet in front of the guy. And he's very good he's got a very strong core. And he's not, basically, you're not going to run through this guy. This isn't like all the other guys we've seen. He's not going to get Drew Samia hump moved, and he's not going to get Dakota Dozier fall on his butt and embarrass himself. Like, that's not what this is. He's gone up against SEC competition for years and years, and has come away with a pretty clean pass sheet out of it. So, in terms of guys who can stand there and protect Kirk Cousins, who's not the most mobile quarterback back there, even if he's gotten better at it with his pocket presence, I think this is a guy who is the runaway favorite to win, just because if a team spends $3 million on Jesse Davis and $2 million on Reed and a second round draft pick on Ed Ingram, especially a second round draft pick on a guy who went up against SEC competition for the last 4 years or whatever, or 3 years if you can't discount the year he was off the team. That guy should be the favorites to start. So some things to clean up. A bit of a leaner. His hand strike and timing is bad, so you can when you take care of his hand, or if he punches late, or you go around, you can swim around him, you can rip under him, you can get around him, and you can get him to be in a bad position pretty quickly. So that's not to say he's going to be like a completely perfect pass protector early on, but I expect him to be an upgrade from what we saw last year at the right guard position. So that much is enough for me to get excited about his on-field play potential.
Yeah. And one thing to wrap up, just in part of the value discussion, he was 101 on Arif Hassan's consensus board. But my personal favorite offensive line evaluator is Brandon Thorne, right? Who is, pretty well known in the space. He works with Offensive Line Masterminds, which is run by Duke Manyweather and has a ton of offensive linemen. Manyweather has a ton of offensive line players in the NFL as his clients in terms of being a personal trainer for them. And Thorne had him actually as tied for the best guard that was available at that spot with Jamari Sallier. So he had him a little bit over Parham and some of the other guys who went a little bit later. So I do trust Brandon Thorne's evaluations quite a bit. So I did not feel like it was so much of a reach at the time as maybe the consensus board had indicated. But still, it is notable because, the consensus board is generally pretty good at figuring out how good players are. Like it matches kind of the NFL draft position. So it's noteworthy that it was a reach compared to that. So why don't we jump on to the next player, our third round selection, Brian Asamoah, linebacker out of Oklahoma. I think the interesting question with Brian Asamoah is there were a couple other players, or maybe one other player, Nakobe Dean, who went to the Eagles a little bit later, who's, an interesting conversation in us passing on him and going with Brian Asamoah. I think ultimately the answer was Nakobe Dean's injury situation for many teams was enough to drop him to the third round. The reason I think it's interesting between Dean and Asamoah in particular is the criticism of Dean in the draft process prior to the injury issues, right, was size. Dean's like 5'11" something, still in that 230 pound range, a similar weight range to what Asamoah is. And they actually have similar arm lengths. I think Asamoah's was like 32 and Nakobe Dean's was like 31 7/8. So, and you can double check me on that, Nick. So they're similar sized players. Asamoah had great athletic testing, obviously very fast. That 10 split that we talked about, great jumps as well. Really, really high level athlete for the position. But as I mentioned, is on the smaller side. He's only 6 feet tall. He's 232 pounds, is I believe what his combine numbers were. So, he's got that going for him. I think he's a quick reaction player. One of the things about Oklahoma's defense is kind of interesting, and this is something that was talked about when Kenneth Murray was a first-round pick a couple years ago from Oklahoma, is that they do a couple things that are a little bit unique on defense. So when they see a run play, they ask those guys to trigger immediately. So that may help a little bit with the explosion that he shows on tape, just in terms of linebackers in that system are not worried about play action at all. And it can be to their detriment when you're talking about instincts for a player, right? So when you're watching on tape and they're triggering against the run very hard and they're biting against the run on play action plays, I think that's something that people can ding players for if they don't understand what the scope of the defense is asking them to do. Now, with that being said, it's a question mark, I guess, moving forward in terms of how players are going to be able to react to that when they're asked to not do that thing, right? When they're asked to not trigger very hard, how are they going to be able to read the keys and respond to that? And for Asamoah, I think he's more of a quick trigger run defense player, which is something you like in this Fangio scheme. I think you like your linebackers to be aggressive and play off of the blocks in front of them to be able to fill in run defense. So I'm pretty excited about where he fits in run defense, even if he doesn't have the size, right? He's probably not going to be able to take on blockers directly. Hopefully the defensive lineman out front, whether it's Harrison Phillips, Dalvin Tomlinson, or Otomow, can all add to that mix, right? Or Armon Watts, James Lynch, those sort of guys can help keep the linebackers clean. That's critical for a Fangio defense, and we're going to need the defensive line to do that moving forward. So you want to go on to Asamoah, Nick?
Yeah, I will be candid. I did not get to watch as much Asamoah tape while I've been so knee-deep in Lewisine tape and Andrew Booth tape. So I don't have as strong opinions. So I will only take a few seconds here. One thing I'll say is I don't love the value, especially when Nakobe Dean is on the board and other guys are. I do like the player, but I'm not sure he plays next year, especially like Gabe Henderson, who's he's not like a Vikings scout. He's not a Vikings coach. He's a Vikings entertainment network guy. But Gabe Henderson said he's looking forward to Asamoah getting into the weight room and maybe contributing 1 to 2 years down the road. Like if you're spending pick 66 on a guy, you should not be considering about whether he'll be able to contribute 2 years down the road.
And it's your entertainment network guy whose job is to hype up the team as much as possible, right? So exactly. You're feeding him that information essentially is what the team kind of thinks, I feel.
I also have a personal bias against skinny, lightweight, athletic on linebackers after years of watching Eric Wilson just get bulldozed in the run game, watching Chaz Surratt get engulfed in the college game and then at the pro game, watching Troy Dye just not be able to take on blocks. So to be a linebacker in the NFL, yes, it's important to have the sideline to sideline speed so that you can cover players who are fast to the flat, or you can cover tight ends. You can match up and man up with these like speedier guys as the game stresses more and more space. Being able to carry wheel routes downfield. Like, yes, that all matters, but also if you can't play run defense, you don't belong on an NFL field. That's not to say Asamoah is that bad of a run defender. I just, at 220 pounds, you just worry about, how is he going to be able to he has ways of getting around blocks, and he's smart about it, and he's got long arms, which helps him as well. And he's very explosive. He's got like 90 cents percentile 10-yard split, as everybody else in this draft class kind of does. So he knows that he's small, and he knows that it's something that he has to figure out ways around. But I just worry about, like, how is this guy going to become a starting linebacker in the NFL? Do they have a plan for him to get more weight on him, or is just the plan we're just going to live with this? Granted, and it's worked out before, like Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah, JOK last year, like he worked out too, and he's the same size. So it can work out, but they just, either you're going to need to ask a lot of your defensive tackles to keep him clean so that he can be like an old school will linebacker flying around and keeping clean and making plays on the ball, or you're going to have to figure out something to make him a better run defender. So that's my thoughts on Asamoah. I didn't love the pick, but I can see it working out, especially given that high upside athletic traits.
Yeah, I mean, and the downside of those smaller players is the Eric Wilsons of the world, the Troy Dyes of the world. The upside of those smaller players is also on the Vikings. His name is Eric Kendricks. You know what I mean? So obviously his ability to develop as a player and be able to take on those blocks despite the size disadvantage is something that's important to watch, right? I'm not going to say that. I don't think we can say at this point, as he's learning the game and as he kind of transitions to the NFL, which direction he's going to go. But as I mentioned earlier, it's going to be critical for the defensive line to keep both him and Kendricks clean. Fortunately for the Vikings, I think we do have a little bit of time because of the Jordan Hicks signing. I think I would expect Kendricks and Hicks to be the starters on this defense still. I don't think we're going to see Asamoah gets significant snaps unless it's in sub packages where you need more athleticism for him to maybe be in coverage more often, right? So I think, he'll have the time on this roster to be able to do that with the players that we have in place currently. So why don't we flip it on to the next player, Caleb Evans, our 4th round pick, number 118 overall, corner out of Missouri. And, like Nick said, at this point, we haven't really watched those guys, and you'll get bigger scouting reports on them later, but very tall, very long, very athletic corner, kind of an interesting story. Transferred in his final season as a grad transfer season, I believe, to Missouri, played under Steve Wilkes, who was the Cardinals' former head coach, played a lot of man coverage in the SEC that last year at Missouri. The biggest question with him is ball production is not there. He's got the length, he's got the size, he's got the speed. Agility, probably not great, but he profiles as an outside kind of man corner, I think, or at least somebody covering those vertical, the vertical quarter, the vertical third, or those sorts of situations. Maybe you don't want guys running drag routes. Drag routes are okay, but maybe you don't want guys running intricate in-breaking routes against him, right? But outside of where he needs, quick hips and that sort of thing. But outside of that, I think he's a very good developmental shot in the 4th round. And we kind of already talked about what went on around the pick, where if we don't trade up to get him at that 118, I'm not sure he's available.
Yeah, he's a really interesting study. Clearly, they were sky high on him. You see the traits. I think he's better than a developmental player. I think he's a guy who can compete for rotational snaps as a rookie, especially given his experience against some pretty good competition too. At the same time, I would say, in addition to height, weight, speed, he's got very quick feet. He's and fluid for his size. He's not like Derek Stingley, but he's fluid for like a 6'2" plus corner. He's very fluid for his size, but just very smooth back pedal, very smooth feet. He moves very well. He's got a very good, mirror technique and press. So I like a lot of the movement skills. And I think that was a priority with a lot like Booth. I really like the movement skills. They really pop out on tape. Evans is the same way. he had a really good Senior Bowl. That was also, by the way, true of Ed Ingram. So both of these guys were Senior Bowl risers who went up against other, draftable competition and won most of their reps. So Evans was the same way. I would say the biggest question I have with him is, he did so much zone coverage. So is he ready to be do more man defense stuff?
Yeah.
Especially off man. And I think the biggest concern and the biggest roadblock to him getting snaps is his grabbiness. He committed a lot of penalties. That was also on the plays that he lost in the Senior Bowl, or the plays that were his Senior Bowl lowlights. He was grabbing guys. He was mugging guys. So he's very good. He's good at the catch point. He's great at ripping through the catch point and popping balls out. So in the same way that Scene didn't have interceptions, but had a lot of pass breakups, I think Evans is the same way. I think Evans has worse hands than Scene does, just because with Scene there weren't a lot of dropped interceptions. It was just a matter that he didn't have interceptable opportunities. With Evans, there were interceptable opportunities, and he left them on the field. But when you have all these other traits, that's a weakness you can accept in the fourth round. So, the grabbiness, the penalties, I think those are issues. For a tall corner, he's never going to be the most fluid mover. He's probably a boundary corner, I think.
Yeah, I agree.
You could try him in the nickel, but I probably wouldn't do. You've got better candidates on the roster than Evans for your nickel spot. So, I'm really interested to watch more of his tape and have a more listeners a more fulsome picture of why Kwesi was up late at night in the dark watching this guy.
Yeah,
Kwesi, it was fun. Kwesi really leaned into that. It was very tongue-in-cheek. I know this sounds kind of sensual, but he's an interesting player. I love the movement skills. I'm excited to see if he where he winds up on the depth chart, because I think he could wind up higher than people think.
No, honestly, one thing I've taken away from Kwesi's press conferences is he really is that personable. He is, being an analytics guy, you half expect him to just be a total nerd about everything, which he kind of is in a lot of ways, right? Where he's very obviously very, very into football, but he's not follow the numbers, kind of boring stuff. He's an entertaining person to listen and talk to. So why don't we go to the next pick here? Asese Otomow, out of Minnesota. Otomow. Man,
there you go. Perfect.
Otomow. There we go. Finally. We'll try to keep that rolling. It's going to be a little bit of struggle for me before I hear his name consistently. So he is somebody that is a position we kind of talked about. I think he profiles very well as a 5 technique, maybe a base end, but somebody with more inside flexibility who has a little bit more power to sustain against blocks. We talked about guys like Perion Winfrey or Logan Hall, in that second round range previously. Obviously, Logan Hall went 1 pick before us at 34, so it might have been interesting to see what would have happened if he was available there at 34. But if you look at him athletically as a quote unquote defensive tackle, if you do that testing, he profiles very similarly as an athlete to what Logan Hall tested as. So it's actually pretty interesting there. He's not a good athlete when you compare him to edge defenders. He's also a lot heavier than the traditional edge defender in the NFL right now. So I think he is more of that 5 technique base end who's we're looking at as more of a rotational role than a full-time starter, and as somebody who can back up, Zadarius Smith and Danielle Hunter. I will say, as more of a power player, maybe that's something he can learn in his game from Zadarius Smith and lean on that. He's got good explosiveness at his size, even for edge rushers. So I think that's something that could be relatively interesting if we do develop him kind of on the edge track. Anything else on Otomow?
Yeah, the knocks on him are he was, I think, a redshirt senior at Minnesota.
Yes, he's older as well with 23.
He's older, and it's funny, the Vikings, when the scouts, this year they brought out the scouts to actually talk about some of these players, which I thought was really interesting. You get to actually pick their brains about these guys that you've fallen in love with throughout the process. So with Otomow, they're obviously the length, obviously the burst, and he does his jumps were really impressive, especially when you consider the fact that he's almost 290 pounds. Him putting up jump numbers and a 10-yard split numbers that are comparable to guys who are putting up similarly low numbers or impressive numbers at 250 pounds, that's good stuff. So He's not like an elite athlete, but he does have some burst and some power in his hands, heavy hands, and the length obviously really important. Like I mentioned, he's the only guy with longer arms on the edge this year was the number one overall pick. So Otomow, the problem is there's no consistency. You don't really see it. Minnesota asked him a lot to be like a 5 technique while Boye Mafe lined up a little bit wider on the opposite end. So he was more of a gap controller, and I think that's what his role will be. Although the Viking scouts talked about they see his burst and length having some upside as a rusher as well. So I think he's a guy who you could cross train as like a 4-eye technique if you want him to I think he can rotate snaps on the outside. Probably not like in a stand up wide 9 technique, but I think he can be an edge rusher. I also think he can play 4-eye. I think on passing downs. Vikings are lucky to have a lot of options, but Otomow could be a guy you bring inside as like a pass rushing 3 technique on third down as well. So, not entirely clear how much of a chance he has to hit any upside, given that he's old and he's had a lot of chance to learn all this stuff. And the athletic upside is not the type of There's a reason he fell all the way to the 5th round or whatever. Yep. So. But I see a clear role for him to at least contribute or compete for a rotational role as like that other defensive end that was previously, we didn't know if it was James Lynch or if it was Patrick Jones or who was actually going to fill that role. I think Otomow was actually a very natural fit there. So, if there's one thing he does well, it's use that length to sort of lock out and fill his gap. So, and that's valuable, especially in base defense looks. So, I like the fit. I like the player. I'm intrigued by their talk about thinking this guy has a lot of upside because you don't necessarily think that when you watch him on tape, but certainly the traits and the size are there. So, I like this pick. This was a good one. Fits both need and I think somebody who I think can be an impact player too, valuable premium position too.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's roll on to the next pick. Tai Chandler, running back out of North Carolina. I personally did not love this one. So he is another older player. I believe he was a grad transfer as well. Honestly, if you listen to his college profile, it kind of reminds me, and his athletic profile, it kind of reminds me of Kene Nwangwu, who was an older player coming out, obviously extremely explosive. Nwangwu was very fast. Chandler was one of the fastest running backs at the combine and had the best 10-yard split, as Nick mentioned earlier. Like, he ran a 4.38 with a 1.46 10-yard split. That's ridiculous. The problem with him is he's 204 at 5'11", so not great size for a running back. You like guys to be in the 215, 220 range, especially if they're around 6 feet tall or they're close to 6 feet tall. His agility testing was very poor, and his jumps honestly weren't great either. So when jumps don't really match the 40 time, that's a little bit of a concern to me, just for guys who are, maybe better, they trained for track, right? They train for running the 40 and maybe don't have the explosion and that jumping leg strength to match up with it. Now, that being said, he looks fast on tape, right? So maybe the speed is legit. But going back to what I said, he's an older player, doesn't have a lot of carries, but also, kind of has that rawness that Nwangwu had. He's more polished as a player than Nwangwu was. I don't want to put that on him, but I don't think he's, from reading reports, right, I don't think he's really got great vision, right? He might be more of a pass catching back, more of a kick returner, and we kind of already have that role on the roster. I've seen people mention that, this is an Alex Madison replacement in a year when Alex Madison is under contract. He's not like Alex Madison at all. That doesn't make sense to me. Alex Madison is a player with good, we'll complain about Alex Madison's vision sometimes. He doesn't have as good as vision as Dalvin Cook, who's like an elite NFL running back, right? Alex Madison has very good vision. Alex Madison has very good contact balance. He's a very solid, reliable NFL running back. Tai Chandler is not that. If we're expecting this guy to come in and replace Alex Madison's role in a year, I think we're going to be very disappointed by a player who looks very different and doesn't have the technical skills that an Alex Madison does. So that's my little mini rant on the Tai Chandler pick there. Let me know your thoughts, Nick.
Yeah, I didn't really get this pick. I understand that Dalvin, he's probably not going to play on his contract for $60 million next year. We're getting into the non-dummy years or the dummy years of his contract where it was never really intended for him to play under those years. So with Dalvin getting older and more expensive with his backloaded contract makes sense. And with Madison being a free agent after 2022, I believe, There's a long-term need for running back, but at the same time, this guy is, like you said, we already have a Kenny Nwangwu, and I will say Tai Chandler is a more experienced running back.
Yeah, and let me clarify real quick. I don't really dislike the idea of the Vikings drafting a running back. I just don't think this is the right one.
Yeah, and he is a better runner than Nwangwu. Like Nwangwu coming out, granted he was behind Breece Hall or whatever, but he was like more of a kick returner than he was like an actual running back. And Tai Chandler is actually like, he's old, and part of the benefit of being, mostly a downside, but part of the benefit is we've done a lot of rushing in his college career with the Tar Heels. So he's an okay, like he's like fine in a lot of ways, but I don't see him as a difference maker. I see him as below average vision, below average change of direction. In elite burst, has the same 10-yard split as Kenny Nwangwu, and by the way, also Lewis Cine, which is actually kind of crazy to think about that like Lewis Cine has the same 10-yard split as Kenny Nwangwu, but so very, very bursty and explosive. And the Vikings scouts mentioned with this, and Kwesi mentioned this as well, that they really like his ability as a weapon in the passing game as well. I think he's somebody with that kind of explosiveness, speed, and he's got good hands too. And decent routes for a back as well, like on angle routes or on wheel routes downfield. Like that's maybe where they see his role, where Nwangwu is like, sure, Nwangwu is fast, but can Nwangwu run routes? I don't really think so. So, and with the potential to potentially develop into like a change of pace back once Madison is gone. Probably a significant downgrade from Madison, but I think that's the vision for the pick. At the same time, I thought there were better running backs on the board that would have been better fits for what the Vikings want to do. So I wasn't in love with this one, but we'll see how it pans out. And if nothing else, running backs are fun tape to watch. So excited to do a deeper dive into his tape.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll move on to the next pick here. It's Vaderian Low. He was our 6th-round pick, offensive tackle out of Illinois. He certainly has an offensive tackle frame, right? Nick, you mentioned earlier, he's got over 35-inch arms. That's really good arm length for an offensive tackle. He might be a little bit on the shorter end, 6'4.5", but he's 314. Like, he's got good size for an offensive tackle. He's got okay movement skills, right? It's not elite movement skills. It's probably decent movement skills for the size that he is and his body type. But, it's not what we've seen in the super athletes of the past of Brian O'Neill, right? It's more of a, probably, obviously Christian Darrisaw did an athletic test, probably more similar athletic testing to what we would have seen from Christian Darrisaw. Obviously, he's not nearly as good of a prospect as Christian Darrisaw. That's why he's going in the 6th round, right? So this is a guy who maybe profiles as a backup swing tackle moving forward. I don't have much done in terms of tape work on him at all, but, I don't know if you've got anything else from your understanding. Like, and this is the 6th round, right? We're not getting any superstars here. I think adding to the offensive line depth is important. If they like this player, I'm relatively okay with this pick at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I think the vision for this guy is a high floor swing tackle that upgrades over Blake Brandel. My problem is, does he in fact upgrade over Blake Brandel? Yeah, you like the length, and you like some of his traits in as a his like footwork, I guess, and he's pretty controlled and quick out of his stance and stuff. But at the same time, he plays very high, so I'm not sure. I just see NFL defenders like bulldozing him all day. Yep. So if you can't sink your hips and you can't anchor and you can't, and your pads are always high, you're just going to be an easy target to get bulldozed over. And that's on top of the fact that I think his average athleticism gives him a very small. It's going to be tough for him to set at the correct depth and not overset and not underset, especially going up against elite athletes across from him at the NFL level. So, I grant you that Blake Brandel is not very good. They need to upgrade over him. And Oli Udoh, for the matter, is not very good as a swing tackle either. But I'm just not sure how much of an upgrade Vaderian Low gives you. So I'm not going to sweat it because it's a 6th rounder. But I don't know. I didn't fully understand this one, even though I agree in concept that they need a better backup tackle. I'm just not sure this is it.
I mean, yeah, and it's it's the 6th round of the draft. I'm not sure you're getting a starter in any respects. But maybe we'll move on to the next player here, who I'm going to let you toot your own horn a little bit, because you had Jalen Naylor as one of your late round targets in terms of your day 3 targets for the Vikings. Jalen Naylor did not run the best 40. He ran a 4.5 40, but he tested very well in terms of the vertical explosiveness, and he also had a great 10-yard split. At Michigan State, he's from Michigan State. He's a wide receiver. He was a fantastic deep threat there. Regularly on tape, you see it. So maybe it didn't quite show up in testing, but I think he's got the chops to be a deep route runner, and it adds competition, I guess, with Amir Smith-Marset, and just an element that the Vikings kind of, I think, would like to add to their offense, because while, they don't have a really notable deep threat, or, Amir Smith-Marset was a rookie last year, he could develop into something like that, but they don't have that presence on their roster right now, outside of their top two receivers of a guy who's able to win deep on a regular basis. So why don't you toot your own horn with a little bit more on Jalen Naylor, Nick?
Yeah, I think the most exciting thing about Naylor is the same. I think the scouts, when they talk about Naylor, and when Kwesi talked about Naylor, they talked about the same thing that got me really excited when I watched Naylor before the draft, and that's, I think the term Kwesi used was like separation ability. Like, he's got good separation ability that we see potential in him down the road, and the scouts kind of said the same thing. They like his explosiveness, they like his potential. Apparently, this was a guy that Keenan McCardle was pounding the table for in the 6th round. It's been reported. So this was one of Keenan McCardle's guys. He was like, this is somebody I think I can coach up to, and I think his role in Michigan State is different than I think what his role will be in the NFL. At Michigan State, he was kind of like a, like Cordero Patterson, or like you use him so much on like jet sweeps and vertical routes downfield, and he was such like a deep threat. And he's got good speed, but not elite speed. People were expecting him to test faster, but he's fast, and compared to most college players, he's very fast. But he's more explosive than he is long fast. So fast players can catch up to him. So. I don't think he's not like a burner. I think his potential is how well he moves out of his breaks when he has the potential to, like, I'm not going to put him on like Diggs level, but like the way that Diggs or Amari Cooper or Jerry Jeudy, the way that they're sort of able to just sort of plant a foot and drive and like not lose speed out of their cuts, or explode out of their cuts, or have that fluidity in their hips and their ankles to be able to like make hard cuts and still be able to just like burst out of them. He's got that sort of burst and that movement ability. But you don't see it very often in Michigan or in Michigan State, because that's not what his route tree was doing. And when he ran like post routes, you saw some of that burst, but he like, what do we need? What do we mean when we say he needs to work on his route running? Well, he needs to learn, like, where do I plant my feet? Where do I, what are my specific steps? Where's my body leaning before and after out on my break? And, all that stuff is like, he's at a very rudimentary level with that stuff, because that just wasn't his role in college. But I think he's got a little bit of a potential to be, like one of those like late round guys with a special movement ability in the way that like, Diggs did. Diggs fell in the 5th round because, he didn't test amazingly. He ran like a fast-ish 40, and he had random injuries and stuff. But he had this special ability to like come out of his breaks full speed, and that's allowed him to develop into elite route runner. I think Diggs was a far more advanced route runner coming out of the Terps than Naylor is coming out of the Trojans, or Michigan State. But I think he's got, you see that separation ability, as Kwesi put it, and the fact that McCardle has a vision for this guy, that he thinks he can be a lot more than he was in college. I think that's what's got me really excited. So when I see this was a very deep class, and they passed on a lot of receivers, but I think it also tells you like they have a very specific vision for this player, and I that was the same vision I got out of him watching him before. So that's just, I feel like, does he have a chance to become like a very good, like slot receiver, or just like a very good flanker down the road? I think that's his potential. I don't think very, very few 6th rounders hit it, but I have more hope that this guy hits, like that kind of ceiling than your average 6th round rookie receiver, because I feel like they have a very specific vision, and I see the toolkit, even if he doesn't have any of the training yet, really. So that one I got pretty excited about. So
so that's right. You heard it here first, folks. Nick Olson says Jalen Naylor is the NFL's next elite route runner. That's exactly what he said. He's shaking his head.
Antonio Brown 2.0, same player. Pretty much.
Exactly. No, I think that's a great breakdown. I think that having that short area explosiveness is certainly key for somebody developing at the next level if you're taking a shot this late in the draft. So that's a very excellent breakdown there. So let's move on to the Vikings' final draft pick, 227 overall, tight end out of South Carolina, Nick Muse. His brother Tanner Muse went to Clemson, was a 3rd-round draft pick by the Raiders. Is still in the NFL.
Taken out of his shoes by Justin Jefferson in the national championship.
Yes.
You may remember him from.
Yes, you may remember from that highlight. No, but outside of that, this is a 7th-round pick, right? He's not a large tight end. He's more of an H-back type of body in the tight end role. Just based on scouting reports, I have not gotten to watch like a minute of his tape yet. So based on scouting reports, it sounds like he's more of an H-back type of player. He's got good blocking for that H-back type of role, where he's not necessarily going to be a dominant inline tight end blocker, right? But in that H-back role, he's got good enough blocking, and he also has a little bit of wiggle room, a little bit of catching ability. I watched his press conference. He said he knew he could play in the NFL when he caught he caught like 8 passes, had 100 yards against Georgia in, I believe, 2020. So, he has... he's had some production at a high level in the SEC, right? South Carolina's an SEC school. So you see he gives you a little bit of pass catching ability, a little bit of blocking ability. Obviously in a 7th-round type of player, that's not going to be at an elite level yet, but maybe it's something the team can develop.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add here just because I did not watch his tape, so I'm going to reserve. I'm not going to pretend like I know what I'm talking about necessarily with Muse. And obviously you see the traits, you see the size. He's got a projectable frame, and he's a good athlete for the size, like an 8.8 RAS. Very good 10-yard split like everybody else on this class. So you've got some explosiveness. And, like the thing Kwesi mentioned was like, I like... but getting our coaches like mountains of clay and seeing what kind of sculptures they can sculpt out of it. So I see this guy's probably a practice squad stash that you see if he can develop into something down the road. He's certainly got the frame, the athleticism to do it, but right now it sounds like he's got issues with drops and he's not a good blocker and not really ready to go up against NFL competition. So some way to go, but also, almost 24 years old. So, but it's the 7th round. So if you can get a guy with an 88th percentile athlete in the 7th round, for his upside, like that's fine too. So, we'll see how it turns out. They certainly needed a tight end. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So that wraps up the Vikings draft class for 2022. There are a number of undrafted free agents. Obviously, we've run very long so far today, so we're not going to get to them right now. That'll be for
a 2-hour-long breakdown of Waluigi will come next week.
Yes. What a great name. That guy.
Luigi Villain. Yeah, you gotta love
it. Absolutely phenomenal name. Anyway, so we're going to wrap it up here for the night. I think, I'm Matt Freese. You can find me at Fries Football on Twitter. He is Nick Olson NFL. You can find him, he is Nick Olson. You can find him at Nick Olson NFL. There we go. We are Kindred Skulls collectively. You can find us at Kindred Skulls on Twitter. On YouTube, just search for Kindred Skulls. We post every week. You'll get to see our beautiful faces. The podcast is available on iTunes, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. Leave us 5-star reviews in Apple Podcasts. I believe it's Apple Podcasts now and no longer iTunes that manages that. Leave us 5-star reviews on Spotify. It's great. You can also find Greg Blake, our co-host, at You've Been Greg. Yes. Jesus. It's getting late here, guys. I apologize. But
just very excited about this draft class. We went a little long. Hope you don't mind.
Yeah. But
all the more reason to give us that 5 stars, because what other podcast is going to go through 2 hours after dozens of hours? Literally, I spent dozens of hours watching these draft prospects. So we put in the work. So. Oh,
and you're gonna get more content on these guys once we watch all of them too. Like we're not even there. We've watched like 3 guys. So So no,
But
no.
one of those guys is Lewis Seen, who you can, again, reminder, you can check out my breakdown on zone coverage if you want. It's pinned to my profile at Nick Olson NFL. Otherwise, we'll get back to you with more deep dives on Andrew Booth and some of these other guys in the short future. Until then, enjoy the post-break, the post-draft freedom from the pain and suffering that is the Minnesota Vikings. And we'll see you next time. Goodbye. We love you, Skull.
Yeah, Skull Vikings.
Wouldn't do us any harm. Oh, another first-round corner wouldn't do us any harm. Oh, another first-round corner wouldn't do us any harm. And we'll all cheer on behind, and we'll score the